She had built an empire worth billions and sat across from a man holding gas station flowers, wondering if he would bolt before the appetizers arrived. He almost did. Callum Hayes was 32 years old, raising his daughter alone, earning an editor's modest salary, and completely unprepared for the woman his best friend had neglected to properly describe. Helena Carrington was 50, formidable, and had watched enough men fold under the weight of her success that she had stopped expecting anything different. Then a stranger insulted him, and Callum Hayes did something Helena had never once seen a man do. He defended her without wanting a single thing in return. If this story already has you hooked, you are exactly the reader we made it for. Hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Give this one a like if you believe real love still exists after 50. And drop a comment telling us your city and country. We want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one is worth every minute. The tulips were the wrong choice, and Callum knew it the moment he walked through the restaurant's front door. Not because they were ugly. Yellow tulips were cheerful, uncomplicated, the kind of flower that didn't try too hard. Under normal circumstances, Callum would have considered that a point in their favor. But this restaurant, the kind with no prices on the menu visible from the host stand, with lighting so deliberately dim, it felt like an aesthetic statement made his $12 grocery store bouquet look like something a child had picked from a neighbor's yard. He almost turned around. He would think about that later. How close he came to just handing the flowers to the host, apologizing for the inconvenience, and driving home to Ruby. She was with the Brennans next door, perfectly happy, probably eating cereal for dinner, because she'd talked 9-year-old Connor Brennan into declaring it a cereal night. Ruby could negotiate anything. Callum had no idea where she got it. He stayed because Marcus had called him 6 times that week, asking him not to be a coward about this. Marcus, who had been his closest friend since university, who had watched Callum spend 3 years putting every part of his personal life on a shelf after Diane left, who had finally said, with the particular bluntness of a man who loves you enough to be annoying about it, "You're 32, Callum. You're not dead." So he stayed. The host led him toward the back of the room, past tables of people who looked comfortable in the way that expensive clothing makes a person look comfortable. Like the world was built at exactly their dimensions, and Callum adjusted the tulips in his hand and tried to look like a man who belonged in a restaurant where the napkins were folded into origami. He saw her before she saw him. She was sitting very still at the table, reading something on her phone with the focused expression of a person who genuinely could not stop working even for an evening. Dark hair, silver threaded through it without apology. A dark green dress that probably cost more than Callum's monthly rent. Cheekbones that could cut glass. And when she finally looked up at the sound of his approach, her eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that Callum would later struggle to describe adequately to anyone who asked. He registered in the space of 2 seconds. She was significantly older than he had expected, significantly more attractive than he had been prepared for, and regarding him with the careful, practiced neutrality of a woman who had learned to give nothing away in the first 30 seconds of meeting someone. He also registered that he was holding gas station tulips at a restaurant that charged $30 for bread service. "Callum Hayes," he said, "because what else do you say?" He set the tulips on the edge of the table like a man surrendering a weapon. "These are for you." Marcus described this as casual. Helena Carrington looked at the tulips, then at him. Then she did something he hadn't expected. A small, dry curve of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was the honest precursor to one. "Marcus described you as charming," she said. "We're both working with incomplete information." Callum sat down. He didn't ask the waiter what anything was. He didn't pretend to study the wine list with authority he didn't have. He ordered a beer which the server received with the particular controlled neutrality of a man trained not to react to anything, and looked across the table at the woman his best friend had failed to adequately describe in about 14 different ways. "How much did he tell you about me?" Callum asked. "Newspaper editor," Helena said. "Single father. Apparently funny, though I'm withholding judgment." "You?" "That you were successful," Callum said. Which I'm now understanding was doing some very heavy lifting. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite amusement, not quite wariness. Something between the two. "Does it bother you?" she asked. And the question was direct enough that he understood she had asked it before in other contexts and had developed a reliable method of watching men answer it. "The success?" Callum said. "No. The fact that Marcus thought leaving out the details was a strategy? Mildly. He didn't want you to cancel." He was right. I would have. It was an honest answer, and he could see it surprised her not the content, but the delivery. People didn't often just say the uncomfortable thing plainly, in his experience. They dressed it up or softened it or pretended it wasn't true. Callum had spent enough years as an editor to have lost patience with sentences that worked too hard to avoid saying what they meant. Helena picked up the tulips and turned them in her hand, studying them. "These are cheerful," she said. "They were on sale." "Of course they were. I almost got roses," Callum said. "Then I thought about it and realized roses on a blind date is either incredibly romantic or the most presumptuous thing a person can do, and I didn't know which, so I picked the tulips." She set them down. The almost smile was back. "That's actually reasonable. I have my moments." The first 20 minutes were careful. The particular careful of two adults who had both been through enough to understand that first impressions are not the whole story, but still a story, and that some stories end badly, and that it's worth taking a moment to figure out what kind of story this might be before you commit to the next chapter. Callum asked about her work with the genuine curiosity of a journalist who finds most things interesting when explained by someone who actually understands them. Helena answered with the measured precision of a woman who had learned to gauge how much information a person could actually absorb before their eyes glazed or their questions became pointed in uncomfortable directions. When he pushed back on something she said about market consolidation gently but specifically, citing an article he'd edited 2 months earlier on mid-market publishing companies, she paused and looked at him the way people look at a jigsaw piece that fits somewhere they didn't expect. "You actually read about this," she said. "I edit a newspaper. I read about most things." "Most people say they're interested," Helena said, and then asked me what it's like to be so rich. "What is it like?" Callum said. She went very still. "I'm joking," he said. "Mostly." The almost smile broke into something real and brief, and it changed her face entirely. Callum noticed, and then noticed that he'd noticed, and made a quiet internal note to be careful about that. They were deep into a conversation about editorial decisions, specifically Callum's argument that local newspapers had abandoned accountability journalism in favor of content that could be produced faster and cheaper, and Helena's counter that the economics made idealism a luxury when the interruption arrived. His name was Garrett Phelps. Callum learned this afterward. In the moment, he registered only, expensive suit, confidence worn like a birthright, the particular expression of a man who walks through rooms deciding whether the people in them are worth acknowledging. Phelps stopped at their table because he knew Helena clearly and greeted her with the warmth of a man who considered himself her equal in a world where most people weren't. "Helena," he said, and then let his gaze move to Callum the way you move a camera across a landscape slowly, without particular interest. "I didn't realize you were here with someone." "Callum Hayes," Callum said, because nobody was going to introduce him. Phelps looked at the tulips, then at Callum's jacket, which was good but not this restaurant good, then back at Helena with an expression Callum recognized from every room he'd ever walked into where the unspoken question was, "What are you doing here?" "Is this a business dinner?" Phelps asked, directing the question at Helena, as though Callum might not be equipped to understand his own evening. "No," Helena said, and her voice had gone flat in a way that should have registered as a warning. Phelps considered this. His smile didn't waver. "Interesting," he said. He let the words sit there doing its work. "Then, Helena, I didn't know you'd taken on a charity project." The table next to them went quiet. Callum set down his fork. He didn't feel the hot rush of humiliation that might have come at 22. What he felt was quieter and colder than that, the specific anger of a man who has spent years being underestimated in ways that were dressed up as observations rather than insults. He knew exactly what Phelps was doing. He'd grown up knowing men like Phelps, had sat across from them in interviews, had edited stories about them, had watched them perform their particular brand of contempt with the confidence of people who had never once been made to feel the cost of it. He looked at Phelps. "She's not," Callum said. Phelps raised an eyebrow. "Sorry?" "She's not running a charity project," Callum said. The quieter parts of the restaurant were definitely listening now, and he was aware of that and decided it didn't matter. "But if someone at this table is lucky to be here, it's me. Not because of the money. Because she's the most genuinely interesting person I've spoken to in 2 years, and I'm 32, so that's not a small sample size." Silence. Phelps looked at him. Looked at Helena. Processed the fact that neither of them was going to offer him a graceful exit from this. "Right," Phelps said. "Enjoy your evening." He moved on. Callum picked up his fork, took a bite, chewed. Across the table, Helena Carrington was staring at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. There was something in it, not gratitude exactly, because she was clearly not a woman who needed defending, and he suspected she would be the first to say so. It was more like the look of a person who had been waiting for a card to fall in a particular direction and was still adjusting to the fact that it had. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. It will make him worse when he talks about this later. Probably, Callum said. I don't know him, so I find it hard to care. He has holdings in 3 of my competitor firms, Helena said. He's been trying to get a meeting with me for 4 months. Callum looked up. Did that change anything you thought about what I said? A pause. No, Helena said. Then it doesn't matter. He refilled his water glass from the pitcher on the table. Are you going to eat your dinner? 'Cause I ordered the lamb, and I'm not sharing. The laugh that came out of Helena Carrington was genuine and slightly startled. The kind of laugh a person produces when their body responds before their composure has the chance to intervene. She put a hand briefly over her mouth, and then seemed to decide that was more self-consciousness than the moment required, and just let herself laugh. It was a good laugh. Unself-conscious. It made her look younger and more tired at the same time, in the way that real laughter does. Callum ate his lamb. Marcus and his wife Sarah materialized at some point. They'd been seated at the other end of the restaurant. Apparently, because Marcus believed in giving people space while simultaneously engineering their evenings, and stopped by the table wearing the carefully controlled expressions of people who are pretending they weren't keeping watch. How's everything going? Marcus asked, as though he hadn't spent 6 months orchestrating this. You left out some details, Callum said. Key details, Helena agreed. I told him you were successful, Marcus said to Helena. Then to Callum, I told you she was interesting. That was doing a lot of work, Callum said. Sarah, who had always been more honest than her husband, in direct proportion to how long she'd known him, looked at the tulips and then at the table, and the body language of the 2 people sitting at it, and seemed to make a rapid and accurate assessment. We'll see you both later, she said, and took Marcus by the arm before he could say anything else. They left. Callum looked at Helena. How long did he spend setting this up? He asked. Sarah called me in April, Helena said. I said no twice. What changed? She considered the question with the care of someone who had gotten used to giving accurate answers. She told me you were a man who had never once asked for anything he hadn't earned, Helena said. I'm not often told things about people that I think about afterward. That one I thought about. Callum didn't know what to say to that exactly. He was aware of the weight of it, of the compliment that was also a kind of test, a statement of the terms under which she had agreed to be here, the specific thing she had been watching for all evening. He picked up the tulips from where they'd been sitting at the edge of the table and moved them to the center, in the small vase the server had quietly produced at some point and filled without comment. They look better in water, he said. Helena looked at the flowers. At him, yes, she said, they do. Outside later, standing on the pavement, in the city's particular kind of nighttime, quiet, the traffic still moving, but the urgency of the day mostly gone. They stood apart from each other with the careful distance of 2 people who have had a better evening they planned for and aren't certain what to do with that information. I have a daughter, Callum said. She's 8. She's the main thing in my life, and that doesn't change based on any other variable. I'm not warning you. I'm just telling you, because you should know who you're talking to. Helena nodded. She seemed to understand that this was not a disclaimer, but a fact offered honestly, which is different. I have a company, she said, and a schedule that my assistant considers optimistic and everyone else calls brutal. I don't cook. I work weekends. I haven't been to a farmer's market in approximately 6 years, and I have opinions about this that I've stopped sharing with people because it makes me sound inhuman. Callum looked at her. What kind of opinions? That farmers' markets are theater, she said. Expensive theater. That people go to feel virtuous rather than to buy food. Callum said. You disagree. I take Ruby every Saturday, he said. She likes the honey vendor. Old man named Pete who has a dog named Pancake. She saves her allowance for 2 weeks to buy 1 jar. Helena went quiet for a moment. Pancake, she said. Big golden retriever. Very undignified for a working dog. She looked down the street. Something moved in her expression that she didn't try to hide, which surprised him. That's a good Saturday, she said. It's a very good Saturday. They stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. I'll call you, Callum said. You don't have my number. Marcus will give it to me if I threaten him sufficiently. He almost smiled again. He was starting to understand it was more natural to her face than the full version of kind of punctuation she used when she found something genuinely funny but wasn't ready to broadcast it. "Tell him I said he can," she said. Callum nodded. He picked up the cab he'd arranged, because he was not going to let a billionaire pay for his transportation home, even if her car was already waiting. And his cab took 11 minutes to arrive, and it had started to drizzle. On the ride home, Ruby texted him, "How was the thing?" He typed back unexpected 3 dots. Then good unexpected or dentist unexpected. He thought about it. About yellow tulips in a restaurant vase. About a laugh that arrived before the composure could stop it. About a woman who had sat across from every kind of man, and had still apparently not sat across from quite this one. Good unexpected, he typed back. Okay, Pancake got into the Brennan's garbage again. It was a whole thing, details tomorrow. Go to sleep, Ruby. You go to sleep. He put his phone in his pocket and watched the city move past the window and thought about a pair of gray-green eyes, and what it meant that he was already thinking about the second time he'd see them. He decided he wasn't going to examine that too carefully tonight. Tonight, he was just going to let it be unexpected. He called her on a Tuesday. Not the Monday after the date he'd thought about it, decided it was too soon, then spent Monday evening second-guessing that decision while helping Ruby glue cotton balls onto a poster about cloud formations. By Tuesday morning, he'd concluded that the performance of waiting the correct amount of time was exactly the kind of thing Helena Carrington would see through immediately, and that the honest version of himself would just call when he wanted to call. So he called. She picked up on the third ring, which he would later learn was unusual. Helena's phone was answered by her assistant, Priya, approximately 80% of the time. The fact that she'd seen his name Marcus had apparently sent it ahead. True to his word and picked up herself, was information Callum filed away without comment. "You threatened Marcus," she said instead of hello. "He gave me your number voluntarily," Callum said, under mild social pressure. "He texted me to say you were, quote, surprisingly persistent for someone who pretends not to care. Marcus is a gossip." "He's loyal," Helena said, which is rarer. A pause, and he could hear her moving the sound of a chair, papers, the ambient hum of an office environment at full operation. "I have 11 minutes before my next call. Then I'll talk fast," Callum said.
"Are you free Thursday evening?"
The pause this time was different. Shorter, but weighted. "I could be," she said. "There's a place near the river. Nothing like last time. It's loud and the tables are too close together, and they have 18 beers on tap, which is frankly excessive. But the food is honest, and you can have an actual conversation without worrying about what fork you're using." Another pause. He waited, and did not fill the silence, which was harder than it sounded. "Send me the address," Helena said. "You'll have to give me your actual number for that. The one Marcus has forwards to Priya." A beat. Then she read him a number different from the one Marcus had, and he typed it into his phone while she was still speaking. "Thursday," she said. 7 o'clock. 7:30. "I have a board call at 6 that will run long." 7:30, he agreed. She hung up without ceremony, which he found he didn't mind at all. The place near the river was called Garvey's, and it had been there since before Callum moved to the city. Dark wood, mismatched bar stools, a chalkboard menu that changed, depending on what the kitchen felt like making. He'd discovered it during his first year at the paper, when he was 26, and eating most of his meals at his desk. The bartender, a broad-shouldered woman named Dell, who had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, had once told him it was the best bar in the city for people who didn't want to be performing anything. Callum had been coming back ever since. Helena arrived at 7:43, wearing a coat that cost more than the bar's weekly revenue, and carrying the expression of a woman who had already had a long enough day that the board call was the least of it. She looked around Garvey's, the noise, the packed tables, the slight stickiness of the floor near the entrance that nobody had ever successfully addressed, and Callum watched her take it in. "This is very different from last time," she said, sliding onto the bar stool beside him. That was the idea. Dell appeared from nowhere, as she always did, and looked at Helena with the frank assessment of a woman who had seen every kind of person sit at her bar and had strong feelings about most of them. "What are you drinking?" Dell asked. Not "what would you like?" Not "can I get you something?" Just the plain question, offered without performance. Helena looked at the tap handles. "What's the least pretentious thing you have on tap?" Dell pointed to the third handle, lager. 40 years old. The brewery? Family-owned. Never changed the recipe. No one who orders it is trying to prove anything. "That," Helena said. Dell nodded once, with the minimal approval of a woman who gives it rarely, and pulled the pint. Callum watched Helena wrap both hands around the glass and take a long first sip without checking whether it was the correct etiquette, and something in his chest did a thing he pretended not to notice. They stayed for 3 hours. What he would remember afterward was not any single conversation, but the texture of the whole evening, the way she talked about the things that mattered to her with the unguarded intensity of someone who spent most of their professional life being careful, and what it felt like when that carefulness came down. She told him about building her first company at 31, before anyone took her seriously, pitching to rooms full of men who asked her assistant for coffee refills by mistake. She told him about the marriage, not in detail, not yet, but enough. That it had ended 7 years ago. That it had not been violent or dramatic, but quietly corrosive. The way some things are two people who had wanted different versions of each other and kept that information private for too long. "Did you love him?" Callum asked. It was direct enough that most people would have flinched. "I thought I did," Helena said. "Looking back, I think I loved the idea of having chosen someone and being done with the question. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Callum said. "More than I'd like it to." She looked at him. "Diane," she said. Marcus had apparently been thorough. "Ruby's mother," he said. "She left when Ruby was 3. Not dramatically, she just decided the life she had wasn't the one she wanted, and she was honest about it. I give her credit for that, even now. It was still the worst 18 months of my life." "How did you manage?" "Badly at first," Callum said. "Then better." Ruby turned 4 and started doing this thing where she'd narrate everything she was doing, like a nature documentary. And now Ruby is putting on her left shoe. This is a difficult operation. It's hard to fall apart when you're living with someone who narrates their own shoelace attempts. Helena laughed. The same real laugh from the restaurant, the one that arrived before she could stop it. "She sounds remarkable," Helena said. "She is," Callum said. "She's also a nightmare to argue with because she remembers everything and has no mercy." "That sounds like a compliment." "It is. She gets it from," he stopped. Caught himself. "I was going to say she gets it from me, but honestly, I don't know. She might have just arrived that way." Helena turned her glass in her hands. Outside, rain had started against the windows, the city sound changing in the particular way it does when weather settles in for the evening. "You gave things up," Helena said. "It wasn't quite a question. Some things. Marcus said you used to want to write long-form, investigative work." "Marcus talks a lot," Callum said. "Is he wrong?" Callum looked at his beer. "No, I had a piece halfway done when Ruby's mother left. A long investigation into housing authority corruption in the eastern districts. 18 months of sourcing. I put it in a drawer because I needed the editing job for the salary and the hours I could control, and by the time I had space to breathe again, the angle had gone stale." He paused. "I don't talk about it much. Why not? Because when I do, people want me to be angry about it. Or they want to reassure me it wasn't a real sacrifice. Both responses are wrong, and I'd rather just not." Helena nodded slowly. He had the sense she understood specifically the experience of saying something honest to someone, and receiving back a response that was shaped for their own comfort rather than yours. "It was a real sacrifice," she said. "Yes, and you're not angry." He thought about it. "I'm occasionally frustrated." "That's different. Anger implies the decision was wrong." "I don't think it was wrong." He looked at her. "He's a stable parent, and I was the one still standing. That wasn't a mistake. It cost something real. Both things are true." Helena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed slightly less armor in it. "You know what I've never once heard a man say to me, in 41 years of knowing men?" she said. "What?" "That something cost something real, and it still wasn't a mistake. Men always want those to cancel each other out." Callum picked up his beer. "I'm a newspaper editor. I've spent 10 years making decisions that cost something, and then defending them in print. You learn fast that a decision can be right and painful at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive." She looked at him for a long moment. He let her look, which was something he'd learned, that some moments ask you to hold still and not perform anything. "I want to see you again," Helena said after this. "I want to see you again too," Callum said. "It's complicated," she said. "My life, what it looks like. I don't have normal evenings very often. I have board calls at 6, and dinners I'm expected to attend, and a schedule that treats anything personal as an afterthought. I have an 8-year-old who considers 7:30 bedtime a suggestion and a Thursday copy deadline that makes me genuinely unpleasant," Callum said. "We're both inconvenient," the almost smile. "Yes," Helena said. "I suppose we are." What followed was not a courtship in any clean or simple sense. It was two inconvenient people fitting themselves into each other's lives in whatever space was available, which was sometimes not much, and sometimes unexpectedly more than either of them had anticipated. They had dinner twice more in the next 3 weeks. Once at Garvey's again, because Helena had texted him on a Wednesday saying she had 90 minutes and was near his side of the city. The text was precise and slightly formal, like a scheduling request, which he found endearing in a way he didn't say, and once at a Thai place near her office that was small and loud and ordered quickly and was done in an hour because she had a morning flight to Singapore. She did not suggest expensive restaurants after that first evening. He understood, without it being said, that she was paying attention to what he was and wasn't comfortable with. The fact that she'd noticed and adjusted without making a production of it mattered more than the adjustment itself. She called him from Singapore at 11 p.m. her time, which was 7 a.m. his, while he was making Ruby's lunch before school. "Why are you calling me from Singapore?" he asked. "I'm between meetings, and I thought of something I wanted to ask you." "About the housing investigation," she said. "You said the angle went stale. Was it the sources or the documentation?" I stopped spreading peanut butter on bread. The sources. 2 of them moved on, 1 retired. By the time I had time to look at it again, the officials involved had cycled out, and it was historical rather than current. "So the story still exists," she said. "The corruption existed. The paper trail doesn't expire. Investigative journalism isn't an archive project," Callum said. "People need to care about who did it." Or, Helena said, "you reframe it around the systemic conditions rather than the individual actors, which is the bigger story anyway." He held the phone against his shoulder and looked at his daughter's half-assembled lunch and thought about that. "You should be in Singapore having your meeting," he said. "I have 8 minutes, Helena." "Think about it," she said. And then, differently, "How is Ruby?" "She's currently eating toast and telling me the exact volume and decibels at which school buses are legally required to be quiet, which she read somewhere and is now treating as legislation." A pause. "Where did she read that?" "I have no idea. She reads everything. I can't keep track." "She sounds..." Helena paused again, and this time it was longer. "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet." Callum stopped. He thought about how to say it. "That's not a small thing." "On my end, I know," Helena said. "I'm not saying it is. I'd want to be careful about how it's introduced." "Of course. She's had people come into her life who then left," Callum said. "It leaves a mark. She's fine. She's more resilient than she has any right to be. But I'm careful." "Tell me what careful looks like," Helena said, "and I'll follow your lead." He hadn't expected that. Not the specific thing, the willingness to follow his lead on something that was his territory, to defer to his knowledge of his own daughter without inserting her own opinion about how it should go. It was a small thing, probably. But he'd spent years as the sole parent, which meant he'd spent years having every decision questioned by people who thought their outsider perspective was useful. Helena hadn't offered her perspective. She'd asked for his. "I'll think about it," he said. "Good," and then, briskly, "I have to go. Enjoy the peanut butter." She hung up. Ruby appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school uniform, socks not matching, piece of toast in hand. She looked at her father standing at the counter, holding his phone, with an expression she apparently found readable. "Who was that?" she said. "A friend." Ruby chewed her toast and regarded him with the evaluating gaze of a person who has been observing adults long enough to know when they're being imprecise. "A new friend," she said. "Yes. What's her name?" Callum looked at his daughter, Helena. Ruby considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Is she nice?" He thought about how to describe Helena Carrington in terms that were honest and appropriate for an 8-year-old. "She's very smart," he said, "and she says exactly what she means, which I respect." Ruby nodded. In her world, saying what you meant was a fundamental virtue. He'd made sure of that. "Okay," she said, and went back to her toast. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Ruby had never been sentimental about these things, about change, about new variables in her life. She'd inherited his tendency to observe before reacting, which was either a gift or a small burden, depending on the day. He finished her lunch and put it in her bag and thought about how you introduce a woman like Helena Carrington to a child like Ruby Hayes, and understood for the first time that the answer might be simpler than he was making it. You just let them meet. It happened 6 weeks later. On a Saturday that started as an ordinary Saturday, the farmer's market, in the morning, Ruby spending 40 minutes interrogating Pete about whether Pancake was still eating correctly. Following a stomach issue the previous month, Callum buying 2 jars of honey because Pete looked tired, and the gesture cost him $8 and then became something else. Helena had a meeting canceled, She texted him at 10 a.m. Afternoon is unexpectedly free. This doesn't happen often. Do you have plans? He texted back, depends. Can you handle a 9-year-old in a museum with an overly ambitious dinosaur exhibit? 3 dots. Then I have a PhD in paleontology, Callum. I'm going to destroy her. He stared at his phone. You absolutely do not have a PhD in paleontology. No. But I have a working knowledge of the Cretaceous period that I'm told is unsettling for someone without a formal degree. Do we have a deal or not? He'd laughed out loud at that, standing in the middle of the farmer's market with Pancake leaning against his leg, and Pete had looked at him with the knowing expression of a man who has watched people fall for things and recognized the early signs. He'd told Ruby in the car on the way home. Straightforward, no build-up. Helena is going to come with us to the museum this afternoon. She's someone I like spending time with. Ruby had been looking out the window at the city going by. She turned and looked at him. The smart one? Yes. The one who says what she means. That's her. Ruby turned back to the window. Okay, she said again. And then, after a moment, does she know about dinosaurs? She claims to. We'll see, Ruby said in a tone that suggested she would be conducting an evaluation. Helena arrived at their building at 2 o'clock in a car that was deliberately unremarkable. Something Callum noticed and appreciated wearing clothes that were expensive, but not obviously so, and carrying nothing, which he'd half expected to be a gift of some kind for Ruby, and was glad wasn't. Ruby opened the door. The two of them looked at each other. Ruby Hayes was small for 9, dark-haired, like her father, with the particular quality of stillness that some children have the ones who watch before they act. She was wearing her dinosaur sweatshirt, which might have been deliberate, might not have. Helena looked at the sweatshirt. Carcharodontosaurus, she said, pointing to the figure on the front. North African Cretaceous period, roughly 45 feet long. Most people get it confused with T-Rex, but the skull architecture is completely different. Ruby stared at her. Then she looked at her father. She's right, Ruby said, with the tone of someone reporting unexpected news. I know, Callum said. The museum was the natural history wing of the city's main cultural complex, 4 floors. A new dinosaur hall on the 2nd floor that had opened the previous year, and which Ruby had strong opinions about its organizational logic. Helena listened to those opinions with the specific attention of someone who takes children seriously as informational sources, not as entertainment, which was different from most adults Ruby had encountered. She asked clarifying questions. She pushed back on 2 points. When Ruby corrected her on the temporal overlap of 2 species, Helena paused and said, You're right. I was sloppy about the dates. Good catch. Ruby had looked at her father with an expression that said, I like her, but I'm not going to say so yet. He'd looked back with an expression that said, Noted. They spent 4 hours there. Helena bought them both hot chocolate from the museum cafe without asking, which was the first time money had entered the afternoon, and when Callum started to object, she said, It's $8. Callum, with the dry precision of someone who had decided on a clear line. He let it go. She was right that it was $8. On the way out, Ruby walked between them on the museum steps, telling them both about the inaccuracies she'd identified in 3 of the exhibit placards. And Helena was taking mental notes and asking questions, and Callum was watching the two of them, side by side, in the late afternoon light, his daughter's hands moving as she talked. Helena's head tilted at exactly the angle that meant she was genuinely listening, and something moved through him that he recognized as the particular kind of fear that arrives when something starts to matter enough that losing it would cost you. He wasn't ready to call it love. He wasn't going to be reckless about it. But he wasn't not calling it love either, and that distinction was getting harder to maintain. Later that evening, after he'd put Ruby to bed, or more accurately, after Ruby had accepted that the day was over and retreated to her room with a dinosaur encyclopedia and a flashlight, which was her version of going to bed, Callum sat on his couch and called Helena. She liked you, he said. She tolerated me, Helena said. There's a difference. I'll know she likes me when she stops testing me. She's still testing you? She asked me 3 questions today that she already knew the answers to, Helena said. She was checking whether I'd admit I didn't know or make something up. Callum sat with that for a moment. You noticed. She's not subtle about it, Helena said. She's good at it. But the design is visible if you're paying attention. She got that from me, Callum said, this time without stopping himself. A pause that was different from the others, quieter, more personal. I know, Helena said. He wanted to say something then. Something about what the afternoon had been, what it had felt like to watch her and Ruby on the museum steps. But the words that came to mind felt too large for the moment, the kind that once said change the shape of things, and he wasn't sure either of them was ready for that reshaping yet. "Thank you for coming," he said instead. "It mattered. The way you were with her." Helena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the slightly undefended quality it got when she was being honest about something she hadn't planned to be honest about. "She's extraordinary," Helena said. "You've done that. Whatever it cost you." "Yeah," Callum said. "I should let you sleep." "You should." Neither of them hung up immediately. "Callum," she said. "Yeah." I don't pause, and he could hear her choosing the words carefully, more carefully than she usually did. "I don't know what this is becoming. I want you to know that I'm aware of that. That I don't have a clear category for it. And I'm not someone who's comfortable without a clear category." "I know," he said. "I'm not either. But I'm not." She stopped. "Try it again. I'm not looking for a way out of the discomfort. I want you to know that too." He leaned back on the couch and looked at the ceiling of his small apartment, the water stain in the corner that he'd been meaning to deal with for 2 years, the shelf that held Ruby's overflow books, the general honest disorder of a life lived in a space that was sized exactly for what it needed to be. "I know," he said again, and this time it meant something different. "Good night, Callum." "Good night, Helena." He sat in the quiet of his apartment after she hung up and thought about gray-green eyes, and a woman who noticed things, and a 9-year-old with a flashlight reading about dinosaurs in the next room, and let himself carefully, without pressure, begin to understand that something had already started that he wasn't going to be able to walk back from. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He was almost entirely sure he didn't. The months that followed did not move in a straight line. That was the thing about real relationships. They didn't build cleanly, one solid layer on top of another. They moved sideways sometimes, and sometimes backward, and sometimes they stalled in place, while both people pretended not to notice the stalling. Callum and Helena moved through the autumn and into winter with the particular rhythm of two people who wanted this and were also, each in their own way, waiting for the thing that would make them regret wanting it. It hadn't come yet, which, for Helena at least, was its own kind of problem. She didn't talk about this directly. She was not by nature or by practice someone who led with her vulnerabilities. But Callum was an editor he'd spent 10 years reading what wasn't on the page, what the writer had left out because they were afraid of it, or because they thought it would weaken the piece, or because they genuinely hadn't known it was there. He could read Helena the same way. He'd started doing it without deciding to, which was probably the most honest sign of how far things had gone. What he read was this. She was waiting for him to want something from her. Not flowers, not attention, not her time. Those were things men had always wanted because they were flattering and cost nothing. She was waiting for him to want her money, her access. The Carrington name used like a key to open doors that were closed to newspaper editors, earning a modest salary in a city where modest salaries didn't go as far as they used to. She'd been waiting since the restaurant, since Garvey's, since the museum and the afternoon that had mattered more than she'd intended. She kept waiting, and he kept not asking, and instead of relieving her, it made her more watchful, as though the ask was simply being delayed, being held in reserve for the right moment. Callum knew about the watching. He understood it in the abstract. But understanding something in the abstract and living inside it while also falling in love with the person doing it were different experiences, and the gap between those two experiences would eventually need to be addressed. That reckoning came in November, at an event Callum had agreed to attend without fully reading the room. The Hartwell Foundation Gala was Helena's most visible annual obligation, a fundraising event for arts education that she'd supported for a decade, held in the kind of venue that made you aware, immediately and continuously, of how much everything in it had cost. He'd known it was formal. He'd borrowed a suit from Marcus, which fit well enough in the shoulders and was genuinely decent, and he'd spent 45 minutes in front of his bathroom mirror, telling himself that a suit was a suit, and the people in the room were just people who had more money, and that this was not a situation requiring performance. He'd been partially right. The venue was the city's old exchange building, converted now into an event space with the bones of its original architecture, intact high ceilings, stone columns, floors that rang underfoot. It was beautiful in the specific way of places that have been made beautiful deliberately, nothing left to accident. Callum had walked in beside Helena, who wore a dark red dress that required no commentary, because commentary would have been inadequate, and immediately felt the subtle adjustment that happened in rooms like this. The recalibration. The quick assessment that moved from face to suit to companion and landed somewhere that told you your category. He was not, in this room, Helena Carrington's equal. He was her guest. That was a different thing, and he knew it, And he breathed through the knowing and focused on the fact that Helena's hand was lightly at his elbow, and she was pointing out which board members he'd find interesting to talk to and which ones would bore him inside 90 seconds. Deirdre Walsh, she said quietly, nodding toward a silver-haired woman across the room. She runs the Foundation's education committee. She's fierce and funny, and she'll want to talk to you about regional newspaper coverage of school board politics, which is apparently a specific frustration of hers. I can do that, Callum said. Philip Hargreaves, the man in the blue tie. A slight compression of her expression. He will tell you 3 times how long he's known me, and then ask you something personal under the guise of being friendly. Just know it's not friendly, noted. And Jeffrey Watt, near the bar, she stopped. Her expression had shifted into something neutral and controlled. Ignore Jeffrey Watt. He's been drunk since 5 and he has opinions. About me, and the people I choose to spend time with. Callum looked across the room at the man 50s, florid-faced, the loosened tie of someone who had started the evening with his dignity intact and was letting it go incrementally. I've met Jeffrey Watts, Callum said. Not this one specifically, but the type. I know, Helena said. I'm sorry you have to be in the same room. It's fine. Don't apologize for him. That's his job. She looked at him briefly, and the look was the particular one, the one he'd learned over these months, that meant she was filing something away. Something that had landed differently than she expected. The evening progressed with the rhythm of these events' cocktails and carefully orchestrated conversation, a dinner that was technically excellent and atmospherically exhausting. Remarks from the foundation chair that ran 11 minutes longer than they should have. Callum talked to Deirdre Walsh for 20 minutes about accountability journalism and school board coverage, and found her exactly as Helena had described, fierce, funny, direct. He talked to Philip Hargreaves for 7 minutes, deflected 2 personal questions, with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done 1,000 interviews, and excused himself before the 3rd. He was doing fine. He knew he was doing fine. And yet, as the evening went on, he became more aware of something he couldn't quite name a quality to the room's attention, a frequency in the conversations happening at the edges of his awareness. Not directed at him. Not quite. But not directed at him either. He went to get Helena a glass of water. She'd been on her feet for 2 hours, and he knew from experience that she stopped drinking water when she was working a room, which she called efficiency, and he called a habit worth correcting. And on his way back through the edge of the main hall, he passed a cluster of 4 men standing near one of the stone columns. He wasn't meant to hear it, or rather, the men had calculated that he was far enough away, and that rooms like this generated enough ambient sound, and that people like him, men who arrived in borrowed suits with modest titles and no holdings, were not the kind of people who walked close enough to overhear. They had miscalculated by about 8 feet. The voice was Hargreaves. He recognized the accent, the particular self-satisfied cadence of a man who liked his own wit. Wondered how long before she'd bring one home, Hargreaves was saying. She always had a thing for the unconventional. First it was the sculptor. You remember the sculptor. This one's a reporter, someone said. Editor, a third voice corrected, with the tone of a man who considered the distinction negligible. Can you imagine, Hargreaves said, the salary alone? What's he pulling, 70? 80? Helena's operating budget for a Tuesday. Light laughter. The particular laughter of people who laughed at things that weren't quite funny, because the laughing was the point, not the joke. She'll get bored, someone said. She always does. Or he'll get smart, Hargreaves said. Start positioning himself. Man comes from nowhere. Spends 6 months charming the Carrington woman. Next thing you know, he's consulting on her media portfolio, and she thinks it was her idea. Do you think he's that calculated? I think every man at this table would do exactly that, Hargreaves said, and we all know it. More laughter. Callum kept walking. He didn't stop, didn't turn, didn't change his pace in any way that would have signaled he'd heard. Because stopping would have required a response, and he didn't trust himself to respond correctly in this room with these people and these stakes. He walked the remaining 15 feet to where Helena was standing with the foundation chair and a woman he didn't know, and he handed her the water glass, and she took it and touched his arm briefly and continued her conversation. He stood beside her and listened to the conversation and laughed at the appropriate moments and refilled her water when it was empty and was, by every external measurement, a man having a normal evening at a fundraising gala. Inside, something was happening that he didn't have immediate words for. It wasn't humiliation, or it wasn't only humiliation. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of a man who had walked into a room trying to be himself and had discovered that the room had already decided who he was and what he was doing there, and that its version of him was so reductive and so certain of itself that arguing with it felt pointless. They left at 10:30. Helena's car was waiting. Callum had intended to take a cab home. Ruby was with the Brennans. Not an emergency, he'd paid Mrs. Brennan until midnight, but Helena had already told the driver to wait for them both, and in the momentum of leaving he hadn't addressed it, and now they were in the car, moving through the city's late-night streets, and he was sitting with what he'd heard and trying to decide what to do with it. She noticed. She was good at noticing. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing. Good event, Callum. I said it was a good event." "You've been somewhere else for 2 hours," she said. "You're good at hiding it, but I've been watching you for months. You're not in this car right now." He looked out the window. A bridge, lit amber, the river black beneath it. He thought about Hargreaves and his friends against their column, so confident in their reading of him that it hadn't occurred to them he might be close enough to hear it, which said something about them, the specific carelessness of people who had never been in the position of the person they were describing. "I overheard some people talking," he said. "What people?" "It doesn't matter." "It clearly does." He turned and looked at her. Helena, in the half-dark of the car's interior, dressed the color of garnet, watching him with the attention she brought to things that mattered to her. He thought about what Hargreaves had said every man at this table would do exactly that, and about the 7 months since the restaurant, and about the fact that he had never once asked Helena for anything that wasn't a conversation or her time, and about whether that was obvious to her, or whether she was, underneath her composure, running the same calculation as Hargreaves. "They called me a project," he said. "Your project. The general consensus was that I was either here to get bored with, or to position myself inside your orbit and call it romance." Helena's face didn't change exactly, but something moved behind it. "Who? It doesn't matter who," Callum said. "What matters is that they were saying it in a room full of people who would carry it, and probably have been saying it for months." And that's he stopped. Rubbed the back of his neck. "That's the world you live in, Helena. That's the context that comes with you. Those are the rooms I walk into when I walk into your life." "I know," she said quietly. "Do you?" "Yes." The word was careful and honest. "I've known since the beginning. That being with me comes with," she stopped, "visibility. And that visibility comes with commentary. I hate that it's the reality, but I know it is. Commentary from people who have decided who I am," Callum said, "before I've said a word. Because of what I do and what I earn and what I couldn't possibly want except in the way they'd want it." He paused. "That's the part I don't know how to live with. Not the opinions. The certainty. Like, there's no version of me that's just a man who met a woman and wanted to know her." The car moved through an intersection. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I'm sorry," Helena said. "And then I want to tell you it gets easier. That people adjust. But I don't know if that's true. I don't want to make you a promise I can't keep." He appreciated that. He would have found the reassurance insulting. "Helena," he said, and something in the way he said her name, not the full one, not Helena Carrington, just the word she was before she became a company and a fortune and a brand, made her go very still. "Can I ask you something honest?" "Yes." "Do you think they're right?" "About my angle. About what I want from you." The silence that came after was long enough that he felt his chest tighten. "No," she said finally. "I don't think they're right." "But you've thought about it," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a real question, asked plainly, because he needed the real answer. And Helena Carrington, who had spent 20 years building walls, precise enough that they felt like personality rather than protection, looked at him in the amber-lit dark of a moving car and told him the truth. "Yes," she said. "I've thought about it." He nodded. He'd known. He'd known for months that she was watching for it, for the ask, for the angle, for the moment when the charm would resolve into a request and everything would become legible to her in the way she'd learned to expect. He'd known, and he'd moved carefully, and he'd never asked for anything, and he'd hoped the not asking would eventually be its own answer. "And," he said. "And you haven't done it," she said. "You've had 7 months and more opportunities than most men notice, and you haven't done any of it. You paid for your own cab in the rain rather than take my car. You turned down Marcus's suggestion that I could look at your paper's digital strategy. You've never once mentioned your salary or your rent or Ruby's school fees in a way that opened the door to an offer. Because I didn't need you to solve those things," Callum said. "I know," she said. "I know that. I know it, Callum." And she looked away, looked back. "I still catch myself waiting. For the day it changes, For the version of you that turns out to be the version of every other man. A beat. I'm aware that's unfair. I'm aware it says more about my history than yours. It's not unfair, he said. It's honest. And honest is what I need from you. She was quiet. But I need you to know, Callum said, that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life proving something. I understand where the doubt comes from. I don't resent it. But I'm also not going to keep providing evidence against a verdict that was decided before I walked in. He paused. Either you trust what 7 months looks like, or we're going to keep having a quieter version of this conversation forever. Helena turned her face toward the window. He watched her profile in the passing light, the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the careful way she held herself even in private moments, the old habit of a woman who had learned that letting people see you come apart was a liability. I know, she said, very quietly. The car stopped outside her building. The driver waited with the particular discretion of someone paid to hear nothing. You should go up, Callum said. She looked at him. Are we? She stopped, started again. Is this?
No, he said.
We're not anything. Tonight was hard and I need to process it, and so do you. That's not the same as done. She held his gaze for a moment. He watched her do the things she sometimes did, the internal argument between the composed version and the one underneath, the one that actually felt things and was less strategic about it. I don't want to lose this, she said. I don't either, he said. So let's both sleep on it and not say things in car doors that we mean too much for a car door. Something crossed her face that was almost a smile. You and your timing. I'm an editor. I know when to end a scene. She got out of the car. On the pavement, she turned back, one hand on the door frame. For the record, she said, what Hargreaves and whoever else thinks about you, I don't care. I've never cared less about anyone's opinion. I know, Callum said. But caring what they think about you is different, she said. And I should have thought harder about what these rooms cost you. I'm sorry for that. She went inside. He asked the driver to take him home and sat in the back of the car and looked out at the city and felt the strange particular exhaustion of an evening that had been difficult in ways that didn't show on the outside. He didn't regret going. He didn't regret hearing what he'd heard, because not knowing hadn't made it less true. He didn't regret the conversation in the car, even though it had said things that changed the weight of things between them, made what they were more explicit than either of them had planned. He did regret, briefly and precisely, not eating more at the dinner. The food had been excellent, and he'd been too aware of the room to enjoy it. He texted Marcus at 11:15, your suit was a success. Marcus replied, how'd it go? Complicated. Is complicated good or bad? Callum looked at the question for a moment, at the lights of the bridge, passing overhead again, at the city that was the same city it had been 3 hours ago, and also not exactly. Still deciding, he typed back. He picked up Ruby in the morning. She'd stayed at the Brennans, sleeping over at her own request because Connor Brennan had a new telescope and Ruby had opinions about it, and she appeared at the door in yesterday's clothes with a detailed report on what she'd observed through the telescope and several significant complaints about the telescope's setup that she was planning to write in a note to Connor's parents. Was it a good night? She asked him, in the car, in the same tone she used for everything level, evaluating, genuinely interested. It had its moments, he said. Is Helena okay? He glanced over at her. What made you ask that? Ruby shrugged in the particular way. She shrugged when she'd noticed something and was deciding how much to say about it. You have a look, she said. Not a bad look. A thinking about Sumyon look. When did you get to be this observant? He said. I've always been this observant, Ruby said. You're only noticing because it's relevant. He couldn't argue with that. The following week was quieter than usual between them. Not silent, Helena texted, called once from a flight delay, sent him a link to an article about regional newspaper sustainability, with a note that said this angered me on your behalf, but quieter. He understood it as the space that follows an honest conversation, the period where two people are integrating what was said before they can come back to where they were. He used the space for something he hadn't done in a long time. He opened the drawer. Not literally, the housing investigation didn't exist in any physical drawer. But the folder on his laptop that he hadn't opened in 4 years, the one labeled with a date and a district name, and the names of 3 sources who had, at different times, told him different versions of the same story about where the money went, and who had directed it there. He opened the folder on a Tuesday evening after Ruby was asleep and read through what he had, and then read through it again, and then opened a blank document and started making notes. Helena had said on a phone call from Singapore, so the story still exists. She had been right about that. The story still existed. The housing authority had changed administrations. The specific officials were gone, but the systemic conditions, the mechanisms that had allowed the money to move in the wrong direction, those hadn't changed. They'd just gotten quieter. He wrote for 3 hours that night. He was still at his desk when his phone lit up with a text from Helena. "Are you awake?" He looked at the time. Past midnight, barely. "You?" "Flight landed late. Couldn't sleep. I've been thinking about the gala." He put the phone down on the desk beside his laptop and typed back, "Me too. I owe you more than an apology and a car door. You don't owe me. Callum." A pause. Then another message. "Let me say this properly. Can I come over?" He looked at his apartment. Laptop open, notes spread across the coffee table. Cold coffee from 2 hours ago on the end table. The honest disorder of a man working at midnight. "It's past 12, he typed. "I know. I'm outside." He looked at his phone. "You're outside my building. I had the driver bring me here after the flight. I was going to go home. Then I didn't." He sat there for a moment. Then he got up and buzzed her in. She came up looking like a woman who had been on a flight for 4 hours and had sat in an airport before that, and was still somehow composed in the way that she was always composed, not perfectly, not artificially, but in the way of a person whose fundamental bearing didn't shift much regardless of conditions. Her coat was wrinkled. There was a crease from her flight pillow along one cheek. She was carrying nothing except her phone. She looked at his coffee table, at the laptop, at the notes, "Is that?" she said. "The housing piece," he said. "I opened it this week." Something moved in her face. She didn't say anything immediately, which was unusual for her. "Sit down," Callum said. "I'll make coffee. The real kind, not the cold thing on the table. It's after midnight. Then we'll be tired tomorrow. Sit down." She sat on his couch with the slightly careful quality of someone who wasn't certain what reception they'd receive, and he went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and made the coffee with the particular attention he gave things he wanted to do well. He came back and sat in the chair across from her and put a mug in front of her and looked at her. "I've been waiting for you to ask me for something," Helena said, without preamble. "Since before the gala. Since the restaurant. I've been watching for it so long that I stopped noticing I was watching." She turned the mug in her hands. "It's become automatic. It's not a choice anymore. And that's not fair to you. It's not even fair to me, honestly, because it means I've been here this whole time, and also not been entirely here." Guarding the exit. Callum said nothing. He let her talk. "I was married for 9 years, she said, "and I told you it ended quietly, and that's true. But the way it ended quietly was that by year 6, I knew that every decision he made, every position he took, every time he said he loved me, I was cross-referencing it against his portfolio, against what he stood to gain. Not because he was a bad man, necessarily, but because I'd given him access to everything and I couldn't ungive it, and the only way I knew how to protect myself after that was to never stop checking." She paused. "I carried that here. Into this. And she stopped. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know why you've been watched that way. Not because you did anything to earn it." He looked at her for a long moment. The crease on her cheek from the flight. The careful way she was holding the mug, both hands, like she needed something to hold. "I know why," he said. "I've known for a while. And you didn't say anything. I was waiting for you to get there yourself," he said. "Because you needed to. And because me pointing it out would have felt like pressure. And pressure from me on that particular thing is the last thing that would have helped." Helena looked at him. "I kept waiting for you to become everyone else," she said. The sentence came out quieter than the ones before it, with a different weight to it. Callum leaned forward in the chair. "I know," he said. "And you just didn't." "And I just didn't," he agreed. "Why didn't you call me on it? Earlier, when you first understood what I was doing?" He thought about it. "Because people watch each other for reasons," he said. "Your reasons were real. They came from real damage. Calling you on it without letting you arrive at it yourself would have been me deciding I understood your experience better than you did, and I didn't. I understood the shape of it, but the inside of it was yours." She stared at him. He watched her process this the way she processed things, quickly, with the focused intelligence she brought to problems, except that this was not a problem with a ledger column. "I kept waiting," she said again. And then, for the first time that evening, her composure faltered, not dramatically, not with tears, but with the slight unsteadiness in the voice of a person who is saying something true that they have not yet said out loud. "And I think part of me was also hoping you wouldn't, that you'd just keep being this, so I could keep not being sure. Because not being sure was safer," Callum said. "Yes. Than being sure and being wrong." "Yes." He looked at the woman across from him, the one who had built things and controlled things and managed every condition she could manage, who had gotten up from the worst years of her life and put herself back together with such thoroughness that most people had no idea there had ever been anything to reassemble. He looked at her and he understood completely. And finally, what this had cost her. Not the money, not the years. The decision to come back and try the thing that had already hurt her badly once before. He got up from the chair and sat down beside her on the couch. "I kept waiting for you to believe I wasn't," he said. "Everyone else. I kept waiting for you to look at 7 months and decide that was its own kind of evidence." Helena looked at him from very close. "It is," she said. "I know it is." "Then let it be," he said. "Stop looking for the thing that isn't there. Look at what's here." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the city outside his window made its slow, middle of the night, sounds a siren 3 blocks over. A car. The building settling in its bones the way old buildings do. "I'm afraid," she said, finally plainly without dressing it up. "I know," Callum said. "Me too." She looked at him. "You're afraid?" "I'm 32, and I'm in love with a woman who runs a billion-dollar empire. And I have a daughter who is going to have opinions about this, and a career I'm still trying to rebuild, and an apartment where the ceiling has had a water stain. For 2 years that I can't afford to fix," he said. "Yes, Helena, I'm afraid." She looked at the ceiling, found the water stain, looked back at him. "You're in love with me," she said. He met her eyes, apparently. The word apparently was doing real work there, not deflecting it, just making room for the fact that he hadn't planned to say it tonight, that it had arrived because it was true, and the moment had required something true, and that was how he'd learned love sometimes worked. It showed up when the moment called for it, and didn't wait to be ready. Helena reached over and put her hand over his. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He could feel her hands warm, slightly rough at the knuckles, from years of what he suspected was nervous habit. Not the smooth hands of a woman whose wealth had insulated her from everything physical, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And they sat there in his small apartment with the water-stained ceiling and the laptop still open on the coffee table, 2 people who were afraid and present and unwilling to be anywhere else. She didn't go home that night. She fell asleep on his couch around 2 in the morning, her coat pulled over her, her shoes off, her phone face down on the cushion beside her. He got her a blanket, the good one, the gray one Ruby had given him last Christmas, which was a better blanket than anything else in the apartment, because Ruby had very strong opinions about blankets and covered her with it, and stood there for a moment looking at Helena Carrington asleep on his couch, which was not something he'd have predicted on the night of the blind date, and which was, he thought, one of the better things he'd seen in recent memory. He went to bed. Ruby found her in the morning, which he had not quite anticipated he'd meant to be up before Ruby to manage the introduction to this particular situation. But Ruby woke early and moved quietly, and was standing in the living room in her pajamas, with a piece of toast in her hand by the time Helena stirred. He arrived in the doorway to find the 2 of them regarding each other with mutual assessment. "You stayed over," Ruby said to Helena. Not accusatory, just observational. "I fell asleep," Helena said, sitting up, locating the blanket, looking at it. "Is this your blanket? I gave it to my dad," Ruby said. "It's good." "It is," Helena agreed. She pushed her hair back with the unconscious gesture of someone who had woken up unexpectedly and was not performing composure for anyone. "I'm sorry for being in your living room." Ruby chewed her toast. "It's okay," she said. "Do you want some? There's more bread." Helena looked at the toast, looked at Ruby, looked at Callum standing in the doorway. "Yes," she said, "thank you." Ruby disappeared into the kitchen with the efficiency of a 9-year-old executing a task she found reasonable. Callum looked at Helena. Helena looked back at him, her composure fully rebuilt, gray-green eyes clear in the morning light coming through the window. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She smoothed the blanket in her lap. "Your daughter offered me toast. She's hospitable when she decides she likes someone." Helena looked toward the kitchen, where the sound of bread being dropped into the toaster could be heard. "She's decided the blanket thing," Callum said. She took it seriously. You took it seriously back. That counted. Helena looked at the gray blanket in her hands for a moment. "I should always have known," she said quietly, "that the hardest thing to earn was never going to be yours." He smiled at that. It was the kind of observation that came from really looking from paying the right kind of attention, and it was true. Ruby's approval had always been the variable that mattered most, in ways that Helena had understood faster than most people would have. Ruby came back with a piece of toast on a plate slightly overdone, because she always slightly overdid or refused to acknowledge this and handed it to Helena with the matter-of-fact dignity of a child performing hospitality correctly. "It's a bit dark on the edges," Ruby said. "That's how it comes out." "I don't know why. I like it dark," Helena said. "Really? Really?" Ruby considered this. "Okay," she said, and went and sat on the other end of the couch to finish her own breakfast, and turned on the television to a nature documentary about deep-sea fish, and the three of them sat in the morning quiet of the apartment, with the early light coming in, and the water stain on the ceiling, and the sound of a narrator describing bioluminescence in the deep ocean. And it was not perfectly comfortable. It was slightly awkward, in the way that new things are awkward, the way that arrangements not yet settled into habit still have edges, but it was real. And it was theirs. And Callum sat in the chair across from them and thought that awkward and real was a better combination than smooth and borrowed. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, producing, demanding, continuing without reference to what was happening in this apartment on this floor, and inside, something that had been working toward itself for months had finally arrived at something like solid ground. Not finished, not resolved, not without the complications that were still ahead of them, the ones that would come when the world outside this apartment pressed harder, when the gap between their lives made itself felt in ways that a blanket and burned toast couldn't bridge. But here, present, theirs. For now, that was the thing that mattered most. The morning after Helena slept on his couch, Callum fixed the water stain on the ceiling. Not because she'd noticed it, she hadn't mentioned it, and he didn't think she'd looked at it as anything other than a detail of his apartment, the way you register the particulars of a space where someone you care about lives. He fixed it because he'd been putting it off for 2 years, and something about that morning, the burned toast, the nature documentary, Ruby sharing her blanket without being asked, had made the continued postponement feel like a choice he was no longer interested in making. He patched it on a Saturday, while Ruby supervised from the floor below, offering commentary on his technique that she had absolutely no basis for, but delivered with full confidence. "You're going in circles," she said. "You should go straight. I've painted ceilings before." "When?" He thought about it. "Before you were born." "So never, from my perspective," Ruby said. He came down the ladder and looked at his daughter, who was lying on her back on the drop cloth, with a book open on her chest, looking up at his work with a critical squint she'd inherited from no one Callum could identify. "It looks better," she said with the generosity of someone grading on a curve. "Thank you. Helena would probably have hired someone." "Helena is not here," Callum said, "and I'm not Helena." Ruby picked up her book. "I know," she said. "That's not a criticism." He climbed back up the ladder. That was December. The months after the gala and the car conversation and the midnight couch visit moved differently than the months before, with less of the careful provisional quality that had characterized the earlier period. Something had been said that needed saying. Something had been acknowledged that both of them had been carrying. The relationship didn't become easier exactly, because the complications were still real, and the worlds they'd built before meeting each other were still real. But it became more honest, and honesty, Callum had learned, was not the same as easy, but it was better than the alternative. Helena came to his apartment more often. She learned the particular physics of his kitchen, that the second burner ran hot, that the cabinet above the refrigerator required a specific pulling technique to open, that Ruby had a shelf in the pantry designated for her science experiment supplies, which were not food and should not be treated as regardless of how they were labeled. She learned Ruby's rhythms, that Tuesday evenings were homework and silence, that Saturdays were non-negotiable at the farmer's market, unless there was a genuine emergency, that bedtime was nominally 9, and actually whenever Ruby decided the book she was reading had reached a defensible stopping point, which Callum chose his battles about, and Helena respected without being asked to. What Helena brought to the apartment was not money. She was meticulous about this, about not arriving with things that cost more than the occasion warranted, about not offering to solve problems that were Callum's problems to solve. She brought wine that was good but not ostentatious. She brought a second-hand copy of a natural history book she'd found at a street market that Ruby carried around for 3 weeks. She brought herself, which was, Callum understood, the thing that cost her the most, because Helena, for most of her adult life, had kept herself behind the executive layer, the public layer, the managed and curated version of Helena Carrington that the world received. The version that showed up on his Tuesday evenings was different. She read on his couch while he edited pages. She argued with Ruby about dinosaur taxonomy with the intensity of a person who took the argument seriously. She fell asleep on the couch again twice more, once because she'd had a brutal week, and his couch was apparently more comfortable than her own bed, which she blamed on the cushion depth, a claim Ruby investigated with her hands and declared plausible. She did not in all of this offer him money. He did not ask for any. The housing investigation was growing. He worked on it in the evenings after Ruby slept, sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning, and on Sunday afternoons when Ruby was at soccer, which she had taken up that winter with the methodical determination she applied to most things she decided to try. He'd reached out to 2 of his original sources, both of whom were now retired and willing to speak more freely than they had been 4 years ago. He found a third source through a city planning contact at the paper, a former budget analyst, who had never talked to a journalist before, and who took 3 weeks of careful, patient conversations before she agreed to sit down with him properly. Helena knew about the investigation. She asked about it regularly with the specific questions of someone who understood how this kind of work operated, not vague encouragement, but precise questions about source reliability, document chains, editorial timeline. She'd covered enough business journalism to understand the mechanics. She did not offer to help. She did not suggest contacts or resources or the weight of the Carrington name, which in certain municipal circles carried enough gravity to open doors that stayed shut for newspaper editors. Callum had not asked her to. She had not volunteered. This was the arrangement unspoken but understood, and both of them kept it. What she did was read his drafts. The first time, he'd left pages on the coffee table and gone to make tea, and come back to find her reading with the focused stillness she brought to things that had her full attention. He'd started to say some instinct about the work being unfinished, not ready, and she'd held up one hand without looking up, in the universal gesture of a person who will engage with you in exactly 1 minute, and he'd sat down and waited. She put the pages down and looked at him. "The third section buries the lead," she said. "The budget analyst's testimony is your strongest material, and you've got it behind 2 paragraphs of procedural context that the reader doesn't need yet." He looked at her. "You're right," he said. "I know." She picked up the pages again. "Also, this sentence in paragraph 4, the allocation decisions were made in a manner inconsistent with standard protocol, is doing everything it can to avoid saying what you mean, which is that someone moved money deliberately. If you know that, say it. I'm not at the point where I can say it as a declarative. Then qualify it. Evidence suggests is still stronger than manner inconsistent with. One is evasive. One is cautious. Those aren't the same thing." He rewrote the section that night. This became their pattern on the investigation. He wrote, she read. She was ruthless in the specific way that made the work better rather than smaller. She caught the places where he'd pulled back from the implication of his own evidence. She caught the places where the prose got bureaucratic, where the journalist in him retreated behind the language of documentation. She never told him what conclusions to draw, never pushed him toward a particular read of the material. She pushed him toward honesty, which was a different thing. "You're a good editor," he told her, one night in February. "I've read a lot of business journalism," she said. "Half my professional life is understanding what documents are trying to hide. That's actually exactly the skill set." "I know," she said. "I'm useful occasionally." "Occasionally," he agreed. She threw a couch cushion at him. Ruby witnessed this and looked up from her book with the expression of someone taking detailed notes. The investigation was not the only thing Callum was rebuilding that winter. There was also the question of what he was, professionally, beyond his title. He'd been the paper's managing editor for 4 years, a job he was good at, that he found genuinely interesting, but that had calcified around him in the way jobs do when you stop growing inside them. He'd noticed it before Helena. She had simply, with the unsentimental clarity she brought to everything, refused to let him not notice it. He started pitching. Small pieces at first, because the instinct for long form had to be rebuilt the way any unused muscle gets rebuilt carefully, with attention to the soreness, not going too hard too fast. He pitched a profile of a retiring city archivist who had spent 30 years cataloging records that nobody looked at and had opinions about civic memory that deserved a wider audience. He pitched it to a magazine whose standards he respected and whose rejection he was genuinely prepared for. They bought it. He told Helena on the phone. She was between meetings somewhere. He could hear the background murmur of an office hallway. "They want 4,000 words," he said, "for the April issue." A beat of silence. "Then of course they do. It might not work out. The first draft might be..." "Callum, what?" Let yourself have this for 30 seconds before you start preparing for it to go wrong. He stood in his kitchen with his phone against his ear and looked at the ceiling, the painted ceiling, the fixed one, and let himself have it for 30 seconds. It was harder than it should have been, which was its own kind of information. Okay, he said, good. Now tell me about the archivist. He told her. She asked 3 questions that made him realize he had 2 more things to ask the archivist when he went back. This was also becoming a pattern the way she engaged with his work, not to shape it toward anything, but to make it better by asking the thing he hadn't thought to ask. You should have been an editor, he said. I am an editor, she said, of a different kind of document. The archivist piece ran in April. His editor at the magazine called it one of the strongest profiles they'd published that year, which he did not believe entirely, but which mattered anyway. The paper ran a note about it in the staff email, which produced 3 congratulatory messages from colleagues and 1 from the paper's owner that said well done in its entirety, which was apparently the maximum warmth that man produced under any circumstances. Ruby cut the magazine page out and taped it to the refrigerator, slightly crookedly, and when he tried to straighten it, she told him crooked was fine. Helena saw it on a Thursday evening and stood in front of the refrigerator for a moment, looking at it without saying anything. Ruby put it up, Callum said from the kitchen. I know, Helena said. She told me. She turned around. It's a good piece, Callum. Not good for a first piece. Good. Thank you. I didn't edit it. You asked me 3 questions that changed 2 sections. Those were your changes. I just made noise. She moved past him into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, began the organized assessment of what was in it that had become her habit before she cooked, which she was, against all her own self-description, moderately competent at, though she would not admit this and had a reliable strategy of blaming the recipe whenever something went well. Do you have garlic? Second shelf, left side. Why is the garlic on the second shelf? Ruby reorganized the refrigerator in January. There's a system. I've stopped asking questions. Helena found the garlic. The system is insane, I know. But it works. She started cooking. He sat at the kitchen table and read copy for the next day's edition, and the apartment had the sounds it had accumulated over months: the kitchen, his work, the television in the living room where Ruby was watching something about ocean ecosystems, with the volume at the level she considered acceptable, and he considered loud, which was a negotiation they had managed to reach a functional compromise on. The sounds overlapped, and the smells of garlic and olive oil moved through the kitchen, and Callum sat with his pages and understood, in the particular way you understand things when you're not looking directly at them, that this was a version of his life he had not known he was missing. It was not perfect. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, because imperfect things that you pretend are perfect have a way of reminding you later that they weren't, usually at the worst time. Helena's schedule was still brutal and still treated anything personal as a lower priority item, which produced friction at the edges of their time together, the canceled plans, the late arrivals, the evenings where her phone was technically put away, but mentally she was still in a boardroom. He was not always patient about this. He could be short with her in ways he was not proud of, the particular shortness of a man who had reorganized his life to make space for something, and was finding that the something didn't always fill the space it had been given. She was not always easy to live alongside in the broader sense. She had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a confidence that was usually warranted, but occasionally needed to be walked back, and walking it back was not her natural motion. She could be absent even when she was present. She had a temper that came out sideways, not shouting, not dramatic, but the cold precision of a woman who had learned to cut rather than burn, which was its own kind of difficult. They had a fight in March that lasted 3 days. The specifics were both real and not the real point she'd committed to attending Ruby's school spring concert, and had to cancel at 4 hours' notice because of a crisis involving a Hong Kong acquisition that genuinely could not wait, and he had told her, with the careful control of a man who was angry and knew it, that Ruby had told 4 classmates that Helena was coming, and that Ruby would not say she was disappointed but would be, and that this was the part of Helena's life she had to learn to protect differently. Helena had told him, with the equally careful control of a woman who was also angry and knew it, that she had not chosen to have a crisis, and that the acquisition affected 300 jobs, and that she was doing the best she could to manage a life that did not come with an off switch. Both of them were right. That was the problem with the fight. Neither of them was wrong. Exactly. And yet something real had been damaged, and being right doesn't repair real damage. She had come to the apartment on the third day and sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "I need you to tell me what this looks like from where you are." He had told her. She had listened without interrupting, which was harder for her than it looked. He knew this. He gave her credit for it. "I can't always move things," she said when he was done. "I need you to understand that there are things I genuinely cannot move. I'm not choosing the company over Ruby when a crisis hits. I'm managing a situation that has real consequences for real people." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to move everything. I'm asking you to protect certain things the same way you protect the things that matter most to the company, because they matter most here." "I don't know how to do that yet," she said. It was a hard thing for her to say. He understood Helena Carrington was not practiced in admitting operational failures, which was what this was, at its practical level. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm telling you. Not that you failed. That you need to learn something that the last 20 years didn't require you to learn." She was quiet for a moment. "Then that's a more generous framing than I probably deserve." "It's an accurate framing," he said. "Generous would be pretending it didn't matter." She looked at the table. "I went to the concert," she said. "After the call. I was an hour late." She'd already finished her part. He looked up. "I sat in the back," Helena said. "She didn't see me. I wasn't going to make it about me by announcing I'd come late." She paused. "I watched the end of it. She was very good." He sat with that for a moment. The image of Helena in the back of a school auditorium, an hour late, not announcing herself, watching a 9-year-old play the violin in a spring concert that she'd told 4 classmates a grown-up she admired was coming to. "She'd want to know you came," he said. "I thought you might tell her. You should tell her yourself." Helena nodded. She did, that afternoon, matter of fact, without making it a large emotional event, just, "I came late and I sat in the back. You were excellent. I'm sorry I missed your part." Ruby had received this information with the evaluating stillness she brought to things that mattered to her, and then said, "I played a wrong note in the second piece. Did you hear it?" And Helena had said no. Was it significant? And Ruby had said a little. "But it's fine. It happens. It happens." Ruby at 9, dispensing grace with the casualness of someone who had practiced it young, out of necessity, and had found it was a better thing to carry than the alternative. The investigation was finished in late April. Not finished investigations were never finished. There was always more material, always another thread. But it reached the point where what he had was what he was going to have, and what he had was enough. The story was about systemic failure in the Housing Authority's capital allocation process over a 14-year period, documented through budget records, internal communications obtained through public records requests, and testimony from 4 sources. It was not the story he'd started 4 years ago. That story had been about individuals, about specific officials who had made specific choices. This one was larger, and in some ways more unsettling, because it was about the conditions that made those choices not just possible but predictable. He sent it to 3 publications. His first choice was the one he'd always read as a journalist, not the largest, not the most famous, but the one that had published the work he most respected over the last 20 years, the kind of magazine that still believed a 9,000-word investigation was a public service rather than an indulgence. They came back in 11 days, which was fast. His editor there, a woman named Bridget Fenn, whom he'd corresponded with but never met, wanted 2 revisions and had specific notes. He revised for 10 days. Helena read every version. She said, "After the 3rd, you're done. Stop touching it. The second section still feels like you're afraid," she said. "The work isn't afraid. You are. Those are different problems." He sent it back. Bridget Fenn called him on a Thursday afternoon. "We're running it," she said, "September issue. We want to give it the real estate it deserves." He was standing on the pavement outside his building when she called, on his way back from picking up Ruby's prescription from the pharmacy. He stood on the pavement in the April afternoon and said, "Thank you," and meant it in the particular way you mean thank you, when the thing being given back to you is something you'd thought might be gone for good. He called Helena from the same pavement. "September," he said. A silence on her end. "Then Bridget Fenn's?" "Callum." Her voice had something in it he recognized but didn't hear often, the sound of genuine, unmanaged feeling. "That's the right place for it. That's exactly the right place." "I know. How do you feel?" He looked up at the sky above the street, gray and ordinary, the specific gray of late April when the weather hasn't decided yet, and thought about the folder that had sat unopened for 4 years, the investigation he'd put in a drawer when Ruby was 3, and the life he'd planned had reorganized itself entirely around a different set of priorities. Terrified, he said, and like myself, both at the same time. That's what it's supposed to feel like, Lena said, when you're doing the right thing. He went upstairs and told Ruby, who responded by asking what specifically the investigation was about, and when he explained it in terms accessible to a 9-year-old, that some people in charge of building houses for families who needed them had misused the money meant for that purpose, and that he'd written a story explaining how so that people would know. Ruby listened carefully and then said, "So you fixed something?" "I documented something," he corrected. "Fixing is someone else's job." Ruby considered this. "But you started it," she said. "I wrote it down," he said. "That's starting," she said, with the authority of a person who had decided, and went back to her book. He thought about that for a while. The idea that writing it down was starting something. That the story, however long it had taken to arrive at this form, was not a rescue of what he'd been before, but a continuation of it. That the years of editing, of Ruby's school, pickups, and cheap dinners and ceiling repairs and farmers' markets with Pete and Pancake had not been time lost, but time that had made him a different kind of journalist than he would have been at 28, less interested in the individual culprit and more interested in the system that kept producing them. Marcus came over that evening with a bottle of something nicer than what they usually drank, and sat at Callum's kitchen table with the satisfaction of a man who had been right about something for a long time and was too decent to fully gloat about it. "I told you," Marcus said. "You told me Helena was interesting," Callum said. "That's all you told me." It implied the rest. Helena arrived 40 minutes later, still in her work clothes from a board meeting, and Marcus stood up when she came in with the slightly formal quality of a man who had spent 2 years watching from a respectful distance and hadn't quite worked out the correct greeting for this stage of proceedings. "Congratulations are apparently in order," Marcus said to Callum. "The magazine, yes," Callum said. Among other things, Marcus said, looking between them with the barely suppressed expression of a man who had arranged a blind date and was now watching what it had become. "Marcus," Helena said in the tone of a woman who understood exactly what he was doing and found it endearing despite herself. "I'm being subtle," Marcus said. "You're catastrophically bad at subtle," she said. "But thank you." Sarah arrived 20 minutes after Marcus, having been texted by her husband with a message that apparently conveyed the general significance of the evening, and they sat around Callum's table drinking the nicer wine and talking about the investigation and about Marcus's job and about a trip Sarah wanted to take and about a book Ruby had been reading that she came out of her room specifically to discuss. With the assembled adults, staying for 30 minutes past her negotiated bedtime before Callum drew the line. The evening had the texture of something Callum had not experienced in a long time, the particular ease of adults who genuinely like each other gathered around a table without agenda. It was messy and slightly too loud, and the wine was better than the occasion strictly required, and Marcus made a speech that was both embarrassing and accurate, and Sarah told him to sit down before he got to the end of it. Helena sat beside Callum and was present in a way that she was not always present, at events that required her performance, not working the room, not managing the interaction, just there. She laughed at Marcus's speech before Sarah shut it down. She topped up Sarah's glass without being asked. She argued with Marcus about a city rezoning decision with the confident specificity of someone who had read the planning documents and had opinions. When Marcus and Sarah left, the apartment settled back into its nighttime quiet. Ruby was asleep. The wine glasses were on the counter. Callum was at the sink, and Helena was sitting at the table with her heels off, and her feet tucked under her on the chair, which was a posture he associated with the version of her that existed after the performance was done for the day. "Good evening," she said. "Yes," he said. "You should be proud of yourself," she said. "About the piece. I'm getting there." "Don't wait too long," she said. "Pride has a shelf life if you don't use it." He dried his hands and turned around and looked at her at Helena in his kitchen in her stocking feet, glass of water in hand, looking at him with the gray-green eyes that he had by now memorized in more lighting conditions than he could count. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. The piece runs in September. I want you to read it. The final version, exactly as published." "I've read every draft," she said. "I know. I want you to read the one with my name on it. At the table. When it's out." She looked at him for a moment. Understanding, he thought, that this was not a simple request, that what he was asking was for her to be there when it was real, not just when it was work in progress. To sit at the table, whatever that table literally was, and read it as a published thing, as something that existed in the world under his name. "Yes," she said. He came back to the table and sat across from her. Helena, he said. What would you want? If you could have something from this. From us. He paused. Not practically, not scheduling. Just what would you want? She put her water glass down and looked at him with the particular attention of a woman who took questions seriously and gave them the time they deserved. I want to stop feeling like it's temporary, she said. I want to stop waiting for the version of this where it falls apart. I've been managing against that outcome since the restaurant, and she stopped. It's exhausting, and I think I'm ready to be done with it. Then be done with it, he said. It's Nana. He waited until she met his eyes. Be done with it. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen clock made its sound. Outside, the city was doing its city things. I'm trying, she said. I know, he said. I see it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way she'd done on his couch, on the night she'd come from the airport, and said the honest thing and started something shifting. Her hands were warm and slightly rough at the knuckles and entirely familiar to him now, which was its own kind of landmark. I have something for you, she said. She reached into her coat pocket, it was on the back of the chair, and put something on the table between them. A key on a plain ring, he looked at it. That's a house key, he said. Yes. This is not your address, he said, because he knew her address, had been to her building enough times to know the key shape. No, she said, it's a different address. A pause. I've been looking at houses, not apartments. Houses. Somewhere with a yard. Somewhere Ruby could have room. She looked at the key. I found one. It's not large. It's not what people expect when they think of me, which is partly why I chose it. It has a yard and 3 bedrooms and a kitchen that gets morning light, and the previous owners had a dog, so the yard has a fence, which seemed relevant. He looked at the key. Helena, I'm not asking you to move in, she said quickly, because she was a woman who had learned to manage expectations. That's not what this is. I'm telling you I've made a choice, that I've chosen a life that looks like something I want to live in rather than something I want to be photographed in front of. She paused. And I'm giving you a key because you should have one. Not for any other reason. Just because you should have one. He picked up the key. It was an ordinary house key. Brass, slightly worn at the edges because the locksmith had made several copies and this one had been handled. He turned it in his fingers. Does it have a water stain? He said. She looked at him. What? On the ceiling. Does it have a water stain? Something crossed her face, the startled precursor to the real laugh. The one that arrived before the composure had a chance to stop it. I don't know, she said. I didn't check. Worth knowing, he said. I'll inspect it with you, she said. If you want to see it. He closed his hand around the key. Yes, he said. I want to see it. She smiled. Not the almost smile, not the public one, not the version she produced for rooms. The private one, the one that he associated with late evenings and burned toast, and Ruby's blanket and arguments about dinosaur taxonomy, the one that arrived when she had stopped managing her own face and just let it be. It has a farmer's market, she said. 3 blocks away. Saturdays. He looked at her. I checked, she said. Before I bought it. He sat with that for a moment. The fact that she had, in choosing a house that was about a different kind of life, looked up whether there was a farmer's market nearby. Had thought, in the middle of a real estate decision, about Pete and Pancake and Ruby's 2-week allowance, and the particular thing that a Saturday morning with honey and a golden retriever meant to the people she was choosing to build something with. It was not a large thing. It was possibly the largest thing. 3 blocks, he said. 3 blocks, she confirmed. He put the key in his pocket. Outside, the city moved and hummed and continued in the way that cities do, without reference to the particular decision being made in one kitchen on one floor of one building. And inside, 2 people who had each, in their own way, learned to hold the things that mattered to them at a careful distance, found themselves at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, tired and imperfect and present, holding something they hadn't known they were building until they looked down and found it already built. Callum left the key in his jacket pocket for 3 days before he mentioned it to Ruby. He told her on a Saturday, walking back from the farmer's market with 2 jars of Pete's honey, while Ruby carried the bag and narrated Pancake's continued undignified behavior regarding a child's dropped cracker. Helena got a house, he said. Ruby looked at him. A different one from where she lives? Yes, smaller. Yard. 3 blocks from a farmer's market. Ruby processed this at the pace. She processed things thoroughly without rushing. Are we going to see it? She said. If you want to. She shifted the bag to her other hand. Considered the street ahead of them. Does it have room for my books? She said. If I were staying over sometimes. I'd imagine so, he said. We could check. Ruby nodded once with the air of a person who had reached a conclusion and was prepared to move forward on it. Okay, she said. And then, after half a block, Pancake would like the yard. Pancake doesn't come to the yard, Callum said. He could visit, Ruby said, with the tone of someone already planning a thing. Ruby, it's just a thought, she said, and walked on ahead of him with the honey into the Saturday morning, into whatever the next version of things was going to look like. The house had a water stain. It was in the corner of the second bedroom ceiling, small, brownish, the kind left by a slow leak that had been repaired but not repainted, the kind that announces itself quietly and then just exists there, a record of something that happened before you arrived. Callum found it during their first walk-through in May, stood under it for a moment looking up, and then turned to Helena with an expression she already knew how to read. Don't, she said. I didn't say anything. You were about to say something unbearable. I was going to say it has character, he said. Ruby, who was standing in the doorway assessing the room's square footage relative to her book collection's current volume and projected growth, looked up at the stain and then at her father and said, It's smaller than yours was. That's not a high bar, Callum said. Paint it, Helena said to both of them. I'll get paint. I'll paint it, Callum said. You'll do it in circles, Ruby said, already moving down the hallway to inspect the third bedroom. He painted it 2 weekends later, on a Saturday, while Helena was on a call that was supposed to end at noon and ran until 2:30, and Ruby supervised from the floor below with the same critical commentary she'd offered the first time and showed no sign of retiring. When Helena finally appeared in the doorway of the second bedroom, still holding her phone, jacket off, looking like a woman who had spent 2 hours in a meeting that deserved 10 minutes, she looked up at the ceiling and then at Callum on the ladder. It's fine, she said. It's good, he corrected. You went in circles, Ruby said. It looks fine, Helena said again, and that was the end of it. And they ordered food because nobody had eaten, and the kitchen wasn't set up yet. And they ate on the floor of the living room because the furniture wasn't coming until the following weekend. And that was how the house began, with a patched ceiling and takeout, containers, and Ruby explaining to Helena the organizational logic she was planning for the second bedroom's bookshelves, which she had decided would be her room when she stayed over. A decision she had apparently made without formal announcement, and which both adults received without comment, understanding that some decisions are better accepted than deliberated. The summer that followed was the kind that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening. It was a summer of ordinary things done alongside people who mattered, the house taking shape gradually, not all at once, because neither of them had the patience to do everything at the same time, and Helena had strong opinions about certain rooms, and Callum had strong opinions about others, and Ruby had opinions about all of it that she delivered with the calm authority of a person who expected to be consulted. The farmer's market was 3 blocks. They went most Saturdays when Helena was in the city, which was not every Saturday, but was more often as the summer went on. As she began to protect that particular block of time the way she protected board meetings as a non-negotiable, not because she had decided to perform better work-life balance, but because she had noticed, practically, that missing it cost more than attending it. Pete recognized Helena by July. He'd seen her twice before without it. Registering Helena was good at occupying public spaces without drawing attention when she chose to, but on the third Saturday he looked at her, and then at Callum, and then at Ruby, examining the honey jars with her usual selectivity, and something in his expression settled into understanding. You're the one she talks about, Pete said to Helena. Helena glanced at Ruby, then back at Pete. What does she say? That you're the smartest person she knows, Pete said. Her words. She also said you burn toast, but she said it like it was a compliment. Helena was quiet for a moment. It means she was paying attention, she said. Pete looked at her with the evaluating regard of a man who had been selling honey at a farmer's market for long enough to understand people fairly well. Yeah, he said. That's what I thought. Pancake leaned against Helena's leg, which he had begun doing since their second market visit, apparently having decided she was acceptable. She reached down and scratched behind his ears with the self-conscious gesture of someone who had not grown up with dogs and was still working out the protocol, and Pancake's tail moved with the undignified enthusiasm of a working dog who had long since abandoned professional standards. The investigation piece ran in September. Bridget Fenn's magazine gave it the cover line, not the cover image, but the line on the cover that directed readers inside, which was its own kind of signal. The piece ran at 9,200 words, the longest thing Callum had published under his own name, the culmination of 4 years of dormancy and 1 year of rebuilding. It was about the housing authority, about the 14-year pattern of capital misallocation, about the budget analyst who had spent 8 years watching it happen before she talked to a journalist, about what happens to cities when the systems meant to serve their most vulnerable residents are quietly redirected toward other purposes. It was not a comfortable piece. It named processes, structures, policy mechanisms. It made implications that the evidence supported and did not step beyond what the evidence supported, which was the discipline Bridget Fenn had pushed him toward and which Helena had enforced with the ruthless precision of a reader who had no patience for the evasions of uncertain men. The morning it hit newsstands, actual newsstands, the magazine still printed, which Callum had always loved about it, Helena brought a copy to his apartment before he was fully awake. He heard the knock at 7:15 and opened the door in yesterday's clothes, and she was standing there in her running gear, flushed from the morning, holding the magazine. She handed it to him without speaking. He looked at his name on the cover line, then opened to the piece and looked at the first paragraph, the version that had gone through 11 drafts and a final copy edit, and was now fixed permanently, unable to be improved, or second-guessed or taken back. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "Do you want coffee?" "Yes." He made coffee, and she sat at his kitchen table and read the piece again, the final version, exactly as published, the way he'd asked her to while he stood at the counter and tried to feel what he'd thought he would feel, and found instead something quieter and more complicated. Not disappointment. More like the specific deflation that follows the completion of a thing you've worked toward for a long time, when the reality of its existence turns out to be more ordinary than the anticipation had made it feel. Helena put the magazine down. "It's going to do something," she said. "This piece. Someone's going to read it and act on it. Maybe. Not maybe," she said. "The budget analyst's testimony alone is enough for a council inquiry if the right person reads it. The documentation is airtight. You know this." "I know," he said. "Then say so." "It's going to do something," he said. She looked at him. "Better." Ruby appeared at 7:45 in pajamas, with the unerring instinct of a child who identifies significant mornings and shows up for them. She looked at the magazine on the table, picked it up, found the piece, and read the first 2 paragraphs standing in the kitchen. "It's good," she said, setting it down, with the tone of a person whose standard of good was genuinely high and not distributed as a comfort. "Thank you, Ruby," Callum said. "You're welcome," she said, and poured herself cereal with the businesslike efficiency of a 10-year-old who had assessed the situation, delivered her verdict, and was now attending to breakfast. He sat down at the table, across from Helena, and they drank their coffee in the kitchen quiet, and outside the city was waking up, and the September morning was doing what September mornings do, carrying that particular quality of light that is both warm and ending, summer's last argument before it concedes, and Callum sat in it and let himself have it fully, the way Helena had told him to back in April, and found that this time it was easier. The piece did do something. Within 2 weeks of publication, a city council member had cited it in a public statement calling for an inquiry into the housing authority's capital allocation process over the previous decade and a half. Bridget Fenn called to tell him the magazine's tip line had received 3 contacts from current housing authority employees since the piece ran. The budget analyst, whose name he had protected in the piece at her request, identifying her only by her role and the period of her tenure, called him to say that 2 former colleagues had reached out to her since publication, which she took as its own kind of confirmation. He did not celebrate this loudly. He filed it away in the part of himself that kept track of things that mattered and tried not to make too much noise about them. He told Helena and Ruby and Marcus made a noise that was probably audible from his building's hallway, and that was sufficient. What the piece also did, which he had not anticipated, was open doors he hadn't knocked on. Bridget Fenn wanted a second piece. Could he look at something in the transit authority, a related pattern she'd been hearing about from a source she was prepared to share? A different magazine, one whose standards he also respected, reached out to ask whether he was available to talk about a long-form commission on municipal housing policy nationally. A university journalism program invited him to speak to their investigative reporting seminar, which he declined the first time and accepted the second time, because Ruby told him that declining things that frightened him slightly was a habit she'd decided to stop indulging. "When did you become my moral authority?" he said. "I've always been your moral authority," Ruby said. "You're only noticing because it's relevant." He accepted the speaking invitation. Standing at the front of a seminar room in October, looking at 18 graduate students who were at the beginning of the thing he was, somewhere in the middle of, he found himself saying something he hadn't planned to say that arrived from somewhere he hadn't known he was going to reach. The pieces you put in a drawer don't disappear. They wait. And sometimes what they're waiting for is the version of you that's ready to do them justice. I'm not telling you to wait. I'm telling you that if you've had to wait, you haven't necessarily lost anything. You might have just become someone better equipped to write the thing you needed to write. He thought about that on the drive home, about whether he believed it, decided that he mostly did, with the caveat that waiting was not always generative, and sometimes the drawer was just a drawer, and the piece was just a piece that never found its moment. But in his specific case, with this specific work, the 4 years had made it better. He was more certain of that now than he had been when he sent it. What happened in November surprised him more than it should have. He'd been working on the transit piece for Bridget Fenn early stages, source gathering, the methodical, unglamorous groundwork that preceded everything else, and had been at Helena's house 3 evenings that week because his building's boiler had gone out, and his apartment was genuinely cold, and Ruby had a cold herself and the house. 3 blocks from the farmer's market was warm, and had a fully functional boiler, and a bedroom that Ruby had by now equipped with a sufficient number of her books to constitute a satellite library. On the 4th evening, after Ruby was asleep, and Helena was reading on the couch, and Callum was at the kitchen table with his source notes, he stopped working and looked at the kitchen. At the morning light that came through the windows, it wasn't morning, but he could see how it would look, had seen it, the particular angle in early light that made the space feel like something. At the shelf where Ruby's overflow books had migrated. At Helena's reading glasses on the side table, her shoes off, her feet tucked under her, entirely at home, in the way she'd become gradually and without ceremony. He sat there for a long time, not working. He didn't tell Helena what he was thinking that evening. He sat with it for 3 weeks, which was longer than he typically sat with decisions, but this was not a typical decision. He wanted to be certain not of the feeling, which had been certain for some time, but of the timing, of whether now was the right now, or whether now was just the most present now, which was different. He talked to Ruby about it first. Not a formal conversation. They were at the farmer's market on a Saturday Pete's stall, pancake in full devotion to a child with a cracker nearby, and he said, while Ruby was examining honey jars, "I'm thinking about asking Helena to marry me." Ruby set the jar down. She looked at him with the full attention stillness she used for things that required it. "You're thinking about it?" she said. "I've decided," he said. "I wanted to tell you first." Ruby picked up the honey jar again, turned it in her hands, set it down. "Does she know yet?" she said. "No. When I'm working on it." Ruby nodded. Then after a moment she's going to say yes. "I hope so." "She will," Ruby said, with the certainty of a person reporting a conclusion rather than offering encouragement. "She looks at you the way she looks at problems she's already decided to solve." She picked up a second jar. "I'm getting the wildflower one this time." "Okay. And the clover." "That's 2 jars, Ruby. It's a significant week," she said. He bought her both jars. He planned it carefully, which was not typically his nature. He was a man who trusted that most things worked better with less scaffolding, but this felt like a thing that deserved care. He had told Helena months ago that there was one thing he wanted to give her that her billions couldn't provide for herself. He'd known even then what he meant. He just needed the right moment to mean it out loud. He called the restaurant. The original one, the elegant one where they'd had the blind date, where he'd arrived with gas station tulips, and had almost turned around at the door and hadn't. He booked the same table. He bought tulips from the same grocery store where he'd bought them the first time, yellow, $12, the cheerful, uncomplicated kind that didn't try too hard. He asked Marcus to take Ruby for the evening, which Marcus agreed to with the barely suppressed excitement of a man who understood exactly what was happening and was exercising heroic restraint about it. He did not buy a ring from Helena's jeweler, or from any jeweler whose name Helena would have recognized. He bought it from an estate sale, a small shop in the older part of the city that sold the belongings of people whose lives had ended, and whose objects were looking for new ones. It was not expensive. It was a narrow gold band with a single stone, unpretentious, the kind of ring that did not make a statement about money, but did make a statement about permanence. He'd found it by accident, looking for something else, and had stood at the glass case for 10 minutes, before the woman behind the counter said quietly, "It's been here a long time. It's been waiting for the right person," he almost said. "I don't believe in signs." He bought it anyway. He told Helena he was taking her to dinner. He did not tell her where. She was suspicious. She had a precise radar for when Callum was managing information and asked 3 times in the 2 days before whether there was something she should know. "It's dinner," he said each time. "You're being strategic," she said. "I'm being a person who made a reservation." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. She recognized the restaurant the moment the car stopped. He watched her face in the window's reflection, the slight shift, the recalibration, the look of a woman connecting something. She got out of the car without speaking. He came around and they stood on the pavement outside the restaurant where, 2 years ago, he had almost turned around with a bunch of gas station's tulips and chosen the easier path. "Same table," she said. If they got it right, they had. The host led them to the back of the room, the table by the window, where 2 years ago they'd sat across from each other, with the careful distance of people who didn't yet know what they were to each other. And a man named Garrett Phelps had been insufferable, and Callum had said the thing about the tulips, and Helena had laughed before she could stop herself, and everything had started. He put the tulips on the table. Helena looked at them. At him. "Gas station," she said. "Obviously." She sat down and picked up the tulips the way she'd done the first time, turning them in her hands with the same evaluating consideration, as though checking whether they were what they appeared to be. "Same ones," she said. "Same store. I checked." She set them down. The host produced a vase without being asked, because the host at this restaurant had been told by the manager, who had been told by the reservation note, that there would be tulips and they would need water, and this kind of restaurant executed instructions with thoroughness. They ordered. He got the lamb again. She noted this and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of communication. They talked the way they'd talked across 2 years of dinners and phone calls and kitchen tables and farmers markets and arguments and mornings after and late nights, with source notes spread across the coffee table. They talked the way people talk when they know each other well enough that the conversation doesn't need to work for anything, it just is. He let the evening build. He was an editor. He understood pacing, understood that the moment you were working toward required the weight of everything that preceded it, and that rushing it was the same as not caring about it. After dinner, after the plates were cleared, when the restaurant had settled into its later evening rhythm, and the light had shifted to the amber that made everything look like a memory in the process of forming, he reached into his jacket and put the ring box on the table beside the tulips. Helena went very still. He'd seen her manage a board meeting that was falling apart in real time with less visible effort than it took her to hold herself together in this moment. He saw her do it, the composed woman and the woman underneath composing, the two of them arriving at the same posture by slightly different routes. "Callum," she said. "Let me say it," he said. She pressed her lips together. Nodded. "I've been thinking about what I could give you," he said. "I thought about it for a long time. You've built everything you have by your own specific method, and you've done it without anyone's help, and you don't need any of mine. You don't need money from me or influence or a project or a plan. You have all of those." He paused. "What I can give you, the thing I earned myself with work that was mine, that no one paid for or influenced or arranged, is this, and what it means." He opened the box. The ring sat in it plainly. No dramatic setting, no excessive stone. The gold was warm in the restaurant light, the simple weight of something chosen rather than impressive. "I bought it with money from writing," he said. "The archivist piece and the first advance from Bridget Fenn's commission. My money, my work. Because I needed there to be one thing I gave you that was purely mine to give." Helena was looking at the ring. Her hands were flat on the table, which was what she did when she was managing herself carefully. "I'm 34, he said. "You're 52. You run a billion-dollar company, and I patch ceilings in circles. And I have a daughter who is the most formidable person I know, and who has already told me you're going to say yes, for the record, so the pressure is on." She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. "Helena," he said, "you spent 2 years waiting for me to become everyone else. I spent 2 years waiting for you to believe I wasn't. I think we've both waited long enough." He looked at her across the table, across the tulips in their vase, across everything they'd been through to arrive at this particular table on this particular evening. "Marry me." The silence was long enough that he felt it physically. Then Helena Carrington, who had negotiated with governments and managed crises on 3 continents, and built an empire from 31-year-old determination, and had spent 20 years making sure she never needed anyone in any way she couldn't control, reached across the table and put her hand over his warm, slightly rough at the knuckles, entirely familiar, and said, "Yes." He put the ring on her finger. It fit well enough. It would need to be sized. She said practical even in this moment, and he said they'd take care of it, and she looked at it on her hand with the expression of a woman trying to memorize something. Ruby picked the tulips, didn't she? Helena said. He paused. She suggested the wildflower variety. I overruled her. Of course she did. Helena laughed. The real one, the full one, the one he had been collecting for 2 years as the truest version of her. Of course she did. They stayed at the restaurant until the staff began the polite end-of-evening choreography that signals the night is wrapping up, and then walked out into the city's autumn night, different from the first time. The air colder, the city doing its same city things, but the two of them different people standing in it. He called Ruby from the pavement. She picked up before the second ring. Well, she said. She said yes. Then to Marcus. Somewhere in the background, she said yes. And Marcus made a noise that Callum could hear from 2 feet from the phone. A triumphant noise. A noise that had been building for 2 years, and had apparently been keeping itself bottled up through considerable effort. I told you, Ruby said, back to the phone. You told me, Callum agreed. Can I stay up? She said. It's 11:30. Significant occasions require exceptions. You said that. I've never said that. You implied it, Ruby said. Multiple times. He looked at Helena beside him on the pavement. An hour, he said. Ruby said something to Marcus that he didn't fully catch, and then came back to the phone with, okay, see you when you get here. Congratulations, Dad. Something tightened in his chest at that, at the word, at the tone, at the specific Rubiness of congratulations delivered with genuine feeling and without sentimentality, the way she said everything that mattered. Thank you, Rubes. He hung up. Helena was looking at him. An hour? She said. She negotiates everything, he said. She gets it from you. She was like that before she met me, Helena said. I know, he said. You just gave her better material. They got in the car. Helena looked at the ring in the car's interior light, turned it once on her finger, stopped. It's the right size, she said. It is, it fits exactly. She looked at him. How did you know my size? He said nothing. She looked at him longer. Ruby, she said. She measured your other rings while you were cooking once, he said. She told me after. She said she was being practical. Helena turned to look out the window. From her profile, he could see her doing the thing she did when something had bypassed her composure and arrived directly at whatever was underneath it, the slight movement at her jaw, the deliberate steady breath, the choosing to let the feeling exist instead of managing it immediately. She's been planning this, Helena said. Not a question. She's been planning this since you told her the house had a farmer's market 3 blocks away, Callum said. At least. Helena was quiet for a block. I love her, she said. Simply, plainly, without decoration. The sentence of a woman who had decided it was true and was now saying it out loud for the first time, which was how she operated, feeling things privately for a long time and then speaking them when she was certain. I know, Callum said. She knows too. She's never said. She doesn't say things until she's decided, he said. She'll tell you herself. When she's ready. He paused. Give her until Tuesday. Thursday at the latest. Helena looked at him. You can't predict your own daughter. I know her, he said. There's a difference. She looked at the ring again. Tuesday, she said, as though filing it. They got to Marcus's building at 11:55. Ruby was in the hallway the moment the elevator opened, in her pajamas, in her socks, with the expression of a person who had been patient for exactly as long as she intended to be and considered it sufficient. She looked at Helena's hand, then at Callum, then at Helena. It's a good ring, Ruby said. Not showy, thank you, Helena said. I picked the size, Ruby said. I know, Helena said. Ruby looked at her for a moment with the evaluating stillness. Then she crossed the hallway and put her arms around Helena with the particular carefulness of a 10-year-old who is doing something deliberate, not the automatic hug of a young child, but the chosen one of someone who has decided this is what the moment requires and is doing it on purpose. Helena stood very still for a half second. Then she put her arms around Ruby and held on. Callum stood in the hallway outside Marcus's apartment and watched and said nothing, because some things require witnesses and not commentary. Marcus appeared in his doorway with Sarah behind him. Marcus looked at the scene in the hallway and then at Callum with an expression of profound personal satisfaction, the expression of a man who had made a phone call 2 years ago and was now watching what it had become. I arranged this, Marcus said quietly, to Callum. You gave me a phone number, Callum said. It was the right phone number. It was, Callum agreed. The wedding happened the following April. Not a large wedding, neither of them wanted large, which was one of the things they agreed on without negotiating. One of the answers that matched before the question was fully asked. A small venue, a room that held 60 people comfortably and 80 if you were willing to be friendly about personal space. And they were, because the 80 people in the room were the people who had actually been present for the 2 years that preceded this day. And being friendly about personal space felt like the correct tribute to what those years had required. Ruby stood beside them, wearing a dress she had selected herself after rejecting 6 others, on grounds that ranged from impractical to philosophically incompatible with her identity. A yellow dress, the particular shade of the tulips, which she had chosen without telling anyone why, and which Callum noticed and did not remark upon, because some things are more powerful when they remain unspoken. She held a bunch of yellow tulips. He noticed that too. He said his vows to Helena in the quiet voice of a man who is saying something true to a specific person and is not performing it for the room, and Helena said hers with the particular directness she brought to things that mattered, looking at him with eyes that were clear and undefended and fully present, not managing, not protecting, not keeping the exit in her peripheral vision. Just there, just his. The room was the room. It was slightly imperfect in the way that real rooms are. The microphone cutting out briefly during the vows, and requiring a moment of technical intervention, an older relative of Marcus's, who cried audibly from the 3rd row, Dell from Garvey's in the back row with an expression that said she found the whole proceeding satisfactory. Pete from the farmer's market sitting beside her and apparently already knowing her, because the world was smaller and more connected than you remembered until it reminded you. Pancake was not at the wedding. Ruby had asked. The answer had been no. She had accepted this with visible disappointment, and then negotiated a post-wedding visit to Pete's property, where Pancake could be seen in his natural environment, which was agreed to, and executed the following weekend with full ceremony. There are things you cannot understand until you are in them. That is the honest version of what the 2 years had taught Callum Hayes, not the composed version, not the version where the wisdom arrives cleanly at the end and explains what it all meant. The honest version is this. He had believed for longer than he'd admitted that the man he was at 32, the single father, the editor, the man with the water-stained ceiling and the gas station tulips, was a diminished version of something he'd intended to be. He had been wrong about that. Not because his ambition came back, though it did. Not because the piece got published, though it did. But because the years between the original plan and the thing he'd actually become had not subtracted anything essential. They had added to it. The journalist who wrote the housing investigation at 34 was not the same journalist who would have written it at 28, and the difference was not a deficit. You do not become less when life reroutes you. You become specific. You become the particular person shaped by the particular choices and losses and small victories of your actual life, rather than the hypothetical one you'd planned. Callum at 34 was more specific than Callum at 28 had been, and specificity, in the work he did and in the life he lived, was where everything that mattered actually lived. Helena had taught him something too, though she would have deflected the credit. She had taught him by example, through the particular discipline of her own rebuilding, that trust is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She had been afraid from the beginning. She had come to the restaurant afraid. She had given him her number afraid. She had watched him for 2 years, waiting for the thing that would prove her right to be afraid, and then she had chosen, finally, to put down the watching and just be in the room with him. That had not been easy for her. It had cost her something real, and it had been right anyway, and those two things being simultaneously true was a fact she had delivered to herself over and over in the months when the doubt came back, which it did, which it always does. Love between adults, real love, not the simplified version, involves the ongoing decision to believe in a person, despite the evidence of every previous experience that argued for protecting yourself instead. It requires a specific kind of courage that nobody talks about because it doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like a woman falling asleep on a couch. It looks like a man buying tulips from a grocery store because the roses felt like too much of an assumption. It looks like a 10-year-old measuring rings when no one is watching and explaining that she was being practical. 2 years after a blind date that almost didn't happen, Callum Hayes stood in a room of 60 people, 80, if you were counting generously, and married a woman who had taught him that showing up as the specific person you actually are is not a compromise but the only honest option. And Helena Carrington, who had spent 2 decades building an empire that the world measured in billions, had discovered somewhere around the burned toast, and the water stain, and the Saturday mornings with the honey vendor, and the dog with the undignified name, that the life she had built to be impressive, and the life she actually wanted to live were two different things, and that choosing the second one was the most difficult and most necessary decision she'd made. Ruby stood beside them, holding yellow tulips in a yellow dress, and looked at the two of them with the steady, evaluating regard she brought to all significant things, and then, in the quiet after the vows, when the officiant paused before the final words, she reached up and took Helena's hand on one side and her father's on the other. She didn't say anything, she just held on. That was Tuesday. Thursday, like Callum had said. He'd known her, after all. There was a difference. The room was full of ordinary people who had brought their ordinary imperfect love for the couple in front of them. And Marcus was probably about to say something embarrassing, and Dell was going to have opinions about the reception wine, and the microphone was going to cut out one more time before the evening was done. And somewhere outside the city was doing what it always did. And Pancake was at Pete's farm, waiting with the oblivious enthusiasm of a dog who had no idea he was part of the story. And none of it was perfect, and all of it was theirs. And that was the thing, the only thing, finally, that had ever mattered.